Step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. These are his words. Let's begin. The engagement of the Third Corps at Krasny was one of the most remarkable actions of this campaign. Never had there been a more unequal struggle. Never had the general's skill and the troops' devotion shone so brightly. Scarcely had Marshal Ney managed to position his vanguard out of range of artillery fire when a parliamentarian sent by General Miloradovich came to demand that he surrender. Those familiar with Ney can imagine the disdain with which he received such a proposition. The parliamentarian, however, assured him that General Miloradovich held him in the highest esteem for his talents and bravery, and would never propose anything unworthy of him. He insisted that capitulation was necessary since the other French corps had abandoned him, and he now faced an army of 80,000 men. As proof, he offered Ney the opportunity to send an officer to confirm the overwhelming force arrayed against them. The Third Corps, even with reinforcements received at Smolensk, numbered no more than 6,000 combatants. Its artillery had been reduced to 6 cannons, and the cavalry to a single escort squadron. Nevertheless, Ney's response was to make the parliamentarian a prisoner. Using the cannon fire exchanged during the negotiation as a pretext, he gave the order to attack, disregarding the enemy's vast numbers and his own meagre forces. The 2nd Division, formed into regimental columns, advanced directly toward the enemy. I am honored to pay tribute to the dedication of those brave soldiers and proud to have marched at their head. The Russians watched in admiration as they advanced with perfect discipline and a steady step. Each cannon shot tore through entire ranks, yet they pressed forward, each step bringing them closer to certain death. Their advance did not waver for a single moment. Eventually, we drew so near to the enemy line that the 1st Battalion of my regiment, decimated by grapeshot, was thrown back onto the 2nd Battalion, spreading disorder through the ranks. The Russian infantry then counterattacked, and their cavalry, striking our flanks, completed our rout. Some well-placed skirmishers managed to delay the enemy's pursuit momentarily. The Ledru Division formed a battle line, and 6 cannons answered the Russian artillery. Meanwhile, I rallied what remained of my regiment on the main road, where cannonballs still reached us. The assault lasted barely 15 minutes, and the 2nd Division was effectively destroyed. My regiment lost several officers and was reduced to 200 men. The Illyrian Regiment and the 18th Regiment fared even worse. The latter lost its eagle. General Razou was wounded, and General Lenchantin was captured. Marshal Ney immediately ordered the 2nd Division to retreat towards Smolensk. After marching half a league, he directed them leftward across the fields, moving perpendicularly to the main road. The 1st Division, having borne the brunt of the enemy's assault for a prolonged period, followed this manoeuvre, bringing along their cannons and a few wagons. Any wounded soldiers who could still walk dragged themselves along with the division. The Russians settled into the nearby villages but sent a cavalry column to shadow us. As night fell, the Third Corps marched in silence, none of us knowing what lay ahead. Yet Ney's presence alone was enough to reassure us. Without knowing his intentions or his chances of success, we trusted he would find a way. His confidence in himself matched his courage. The greater the danger, the quicker his resolve. Once decided, he never doubted success. In such moments, his face betrayed neither indecision nor fear. All eyes turned to him, but no one dared question him. Finally, he turned to an officer on his staff and in a low voice said, "We are in a difficult spot." "What will you do?" asked the officer. "Cross the Dnieper," Ney replied. "Do you know the way?" the officer pressed. "We'll find it." "And if the river isn't frozen?" "It will be." "Good," said the officer. This brief exchange revealed Ney's bold plan to cross to the right bank of the Dnieper and advanced toward Orsha swiftly enough to rejoin the main army, which was moving along the left bank. The plan was audacious and masterfully conceived. What followed would demonstrate Ney's unyielding determination. We advanced across fields without a guide, relying on inaccurate maps that often led us astray. Ney, with the keen instinct of a seasoned commander, noticed ice in the direction we were heading. Suspecting it was a stream leading to the Dnieper, he ordered it broken to confirm his theory. It was indeed a stream, and we followed it until we reached a village where Ney feigned the intention to make camp. Large fires were lit, and sentries were posted. Believing they had us cornered, the enemy left us in peace, planning to deal with us the next day. Under cover of this ruse, Ney prepared to execute his plan. A guide was needed, but the village was deserted. Eventually the soldiers found a lame peasant who revealed that the village of Sirokawitz was about a league away, and that the Dnieper was likely frozen there. With the peasant leading us, we soon reached the village. The Dnieper, deeply entrenched in its banks, was indeed sufficiently frozen to allow a crossing. While the crossing point was scouted, officers and wounded soldiers who had struggled to keep up filled the houses where surgeons barely managed to administer first aid. Meanwhile, those uninjured searched for provisions. Ney, forgetting both the day's perils and those awaiting us, slept soundly. Around midnight, the order to take up arms was given. We crossed the Dnieper, leaving behind our artillery, baggage, all manner of vehicles, and the wounded who could not walk. Even the wounded Colonel de Briqueville, injured the day before, managed to crawl across the ice with the help of 2 sappers I had assigned to him. The ice was so thin that very few horses could cross. The troops reassembled on the opposite bank. Ney's daring plan had succeeded. We had crossed the Dnieper, but we were still over 15 leagues from Orsha, and to reach it we needed to march through unfamiliar territory and fend off enemy attacks with our exhausted infantry, entirely without cavalry or artillery. Our journey began auspiciously. We surprised a group of sleeping Cossacks in a village, capturing them. On the morning of the 19th, under the first rays of sunlight, we followed the road to Lyubovichi. Only a torrent and a few Cossack posts delayed us briefly. By noon, we reached 2 villages atop a hill. Their inhabitants barely had time to flee, leaving behind provisions that our soldiers eagerly seized. Our brief moment of relief ended with the alarm cry, "To arms!" The enemy was advancing, having driven back our outposts. The troops left the villages, formed columns, and resumed marching under the enemy's watchful gaze. But now we faced more than just scattered Cossack units. Entire squadrons, led by General Platov himself, moved in organized formations. Though our skirmishers temporarily held them off, the enemy cavalry pressed harder, supported by artillery mounted on sledges, which allowed them to reposition rapidly and fire on our columns. Marshal Ney, exploiting every terrain advantage, resisted these relentless attacks all day. Cannonballs fell among us, and the Cossacks' feigned charges and war cries aimed to intimidate us. Despite this, our pace remained steady. As night fell, the enemy intensified their efforts. Forced off the road, we turned left along the woods bordering the Dnieper. The Cossacks had already occupied the woods, but the 4th and 18th regiments, led by General Dnieper, were ordered to drive them out. Meanwhile, enemy artillery positioned itself on the opposite edge of a ravine we needed to cross, where General Platov intended to annihilate us all. I followed my regiment into the woods. The Cossacks retreated, but the forest was dense and deep, requiring vigilance in all directions to avoid surprises. Night fell, and we heard nothing around us. It became increasingly probable that Marshal Ney was continuing his advance. I advised General Denain to follow the column's movement, but he refused, fearing Ney's reprimand if he abandoned his assigned position without orders. At that moment, we heard loud cries, signaling a charge, coming from ahead of us and already some distance away. It became clear that our column was moving forward, and we risked being cut off. I intensified my urging, reminding General Dehenin that, knowing Ney's method of command, he was unlikely to send orders in such a situation, trusting his commanders to act according to circumstances. Furthermore, Ney was likely too far away to communicate with us now, and the 18th Regiment had surely departed long ago. General Dehenin remained resolute in his refusal. All I could persuade him to do was to lead us to the position where the 18th Regiment had been, in the hope of reuniting with them. However, when we arrived, we found only a squadron of Cossacks where the 18th should have been. Realizing too late the validity of my advice, General Dehenin finally decided to rejoin the main column. By this time, we had traversed the forest in so many different directions that we could no longer recognize our path. Fires visible from multiple points only added to our confusion. After consulting the officers of my regiment, we decided on a direction based on the majority's suggestion. I will not attempt to describe the suffering we endured during that cruel night. I had fewer than 100 men left, and we were more than a league behind our column. We needed to catch up, surrounded by enemies. We had to move quickly enough to make up for lost time, yet maintain order to fend off Cossack attacks. The darkness of the night, the uncertainty of our path, and the difficulty of moving through the woods compounded our troubles. The Cossacks called out for us to surrender, firing point blank into our ranks. Those who were hit were left behind. A sergeant, his leg shattered by a carbine shot, fell beside me. Calmly he said to his comrades, "This is the end for me. Take my bag. You'll need it." His bag was taken, and we left him in silence. 2 wounded officers suffered the same fate. I observed with concern how this situation affected my soldiers and even my officers. Those who had been heroes on the battlefield now seemed anxious and unsettled. It is a truth that the circumstances surrounding danger often provoke more fear than the danger itself. Only a very few retained the presence of mind we so desperately needed. I had to exercise all my authority to maintain order and prevent anyone from breaking ranks. One officer dared to suggest aloud that we might be forced to surrender. I reprimanded him loudly and severely, all the more because he was a capable officer, making the lesson all the more impactful. Finally, after more than an hour, we emerged from the forest and found the Dnieper on our left. The discovery of the river assured our direction, bringing a moment of relief to the soldiers, which I seized to encourage them and stress the importance of remaining calm as our only salvation. General Dehenin ordered us to continue marching along the river to prevent the enemy from encircling us. Though our direction was now clear, we were far from safe. The open plain we now traversed left us vulnerable to enemy artillery and massed attacks. Fortunately, the darkness of night worked in our favour, as their artillery fire was poorly aimed. Periodically, the Cossacks approached with loud cries, prompting us to halt and repel them with musket fire before resuming our march. This gruelling trek lasted for 2 leagues, over rough terrain. We crossed steep ravines that required tremendous effort to climb, and waded through half-frozen streams, water rising to our knees. Despite these hardships, the soldiers' resolve remained unshaken. Order was maintained, and no one abandoned their position. General Dehenin, though wounded by shrapnel, concealed his injury to avoid discouraging the troops, continuing to lead with the same fervour. While his insistence on holding the forest had been a costly mistake, such errors are forgivable in the chaos of such trying circumstances. His bravery and competence in guiding us through this perilous march cannot be questioned. The enemy's pursuit eventually slackened. At last we spotted fires on a hill ahead. It was Ney's rearguard, halted to regroup before resuming their march. We joined them, learning that the Marshal had launched an assault on the enemy's artillery the previous day, forcing them to yield the passage. Thus, the 4th Regiment escaped what had seemed a hopeless situation. The march continued for another hour. Exhausted, the soldiers needed rest, and we halted in a village where we found some provisions. Still 8 leagues from Orsha, we knew General Platov would likely intensify his efforts to capture us. Time was of the essence. At 1 in the morning, the drums signalled the march's resumption. The village was aflame, its fiery glow casting a sombre hue over the darkness. I gazed at the scene with deep sorrow. The prior day's fatigue and the water that had seeped into my boots exacerbated my suffering. Struggling to walk, I leaned on Lieutenant Lalande, a young officer of voltigeurs. Lalande, once subject to criticism for his earlier conduct in the campaign and denied the captaincy his seniority merited, had shown commendable zeal. Pleased with his recent performance, I seized the moment to promise him the next available captaincy in the regiment, expressing my regret over the delay. His gratitude was profound, and his renewed efforts were steadfast until his strength finally failed him. That young man ultimately perished, but I take solace in the thought that the hope I offered may have sustained him in his final moments. We marched through the night without incident. At dawn, the Cossacks reappeared, and the road led us into an open plain. General Platov, eager to exploit the terrain, brought up artillery on sledges, which we could neither evade nor counter. Believing our ranks disrupted, he ordered a full charge. Ney swiftly organised his 2 divisions into squares. The 2nd Division, under General de Hénin and serving as the rearguard, bore the brunt of the assault. All stragglers still armed were forcibly incorporated into the squares. Stern threats were needed to ensure their compliance. The Cossacks, driving before them a mass of unarmed stragglers, sought to overwhelm the squares. Under the enemy's artillery fire and their proximity, the soldiers were tempted to scatter and flee. 20 times I saw them on the verge of breaking ranks and surrendering to the mercy of the Cossacks. Yet Ney's calm demeanour and inspiring presence kept them steady. Reaching a hill, Ney ordered de Hénin to hold the position, declaring it a place to die for France's honour. Meanwhile, General Ledru secured the village of Jokubo, backed by a forest. Once established, we joined him, positioning the divisions to cover each other's flanks. Though it was not yet noon, Ney vowed to hold the village until 9 that evening. Platov launched 20 attacks, all repulsed. Exhausted by our resilience, the enemy settled into positions across from us. The Marshal had sent a Polish officer early in the morning who managed to reach Orsha and deliver news of our situation. The Emperor had departed the previous day, but the Viceroy and Marshal Davout were still in the city. At 9 o'clock in the evening, we took up arms and began marching in the utmost silence. The Cossack outposts stationed along the road withdrew at our approach. The march continued with great order. About a league from Orsha, the vanguard encountered an advanced post. They responded in French. It was a division from the 4th Corps coming to our aid with the Viceroy. Only those who have spent 3 days hovering between life and death can truly understand the joy this meeting brought us. The Viceroy greeted us with deep emotion and openly expressed his admiration for Marshal Ney's leadership. He congratulated the generals and the 2 remaining colonels. His aides-de-camp surrounded us, eagerly bombarding us with questions about the details of this extraordinary ordeal and the roles each of us had played. But time was short, and after only a few moments, we had to resume our march toward Orsha. The Viceroy insisted on taking responsibility for the rearguard. By 3 o'clock in the morning, we entered the city. A few humble houses in the outskirts served as our shelter. Distributions of supplies were promised for the next day, and at long last, we were allowed to rest. Thus concluded this bold march, one of the most remarkable episodes of the campaign. It brought great glory to Marshal Ney, and the 3rd Corps owed its survival to him. If one can still call a force of 800 or 900 men a corps, the remnant of the 6,000 who had fought at Krasny. That concludes the 14th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.